A dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road. A long, agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and another, till, borne on the wind which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild... With howling dogs, a shimmering moon, and a chill wind through a darkened landscape, these words could only come from one novel, the great horror classic Dracula, penned by the Irish-born writer Bram Stoker. The name Dracula strikes fear whenever it's mentioned. Such is the power of this novel about a monstrous vampire that feeds on human blood. The character of Count Dracula himself has become as legendary as the hideous Frankenstein's monster in the history of horror. While the story of Dracula has been used time and again in films, dating back to the early 20th century and the silent movies, right up to the present day and the post-millennium Hollywood blockbuster. But what of the author of this gruesome novel of bloodlust? Who created this tale of the living dead, sucking every last drop of blood from their unsuspecting victims? In precisely the same way that Mary Shelley is little recognized for Frankenstein, the novel she created when she was a mere 18 years old, the author of Dracula, Bram Stoker, is a similarly overlooked figure in the world of literature. Abraham Stoker, shortened to Bram when he was a child, was born on the outskirts of Ireland's capital city Dublin in 1847. As a young man, his early life was spent in Dublin, where he worked as a civil servant, a career that was stable if uninspiring. But in later years he moved to England, preferring to risk all for the world of the theater, becoming the manager of the renowned and flamboyant actor Henry Irving, based at the magnificent Lyceum Theatre in London. The two halves of Bram Stoker's life could not have been more contrasting. And as we set out on this journey of discovery to find both Dracula and his creator, it's immediately evident that our road will take us in a number of different directions. The novel Dracula, first published in 1897, after 7 years of research and writing, was launched as Great Britain neared the end of a century that had exhibited more technological, scientific, literary, and medical advancement than ever before. Queen Victoria's long reign was drawing to a close, but the respectability she had imposed on British life still dominated. However, despite being a time of strict morals on the surface, Victorian Britain certainly possessed its darker side. On the one side, high-born ladies and gentlemen sipped tea in elegant drawing rooms, while on London's mean streets, prostitution was rife. Opium dens and gin palaces were to be found if you knew where to look, and this was far from being the age of innocence. As the father of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud, would prove, sexual repression was bad for the health. And just because manners and etiquette prevented passion being expressed, it didn't mean that the late Victorians lacked desire. Now, although Bram Stoker is one of the least instantly recognizable Dublin authors, he certainly was part of an illustrious company of writers who heralded from this fair city. This was the birthplace of Oscar Wilde, acclaimed novelist and playwright, whose works include The Importance of Being Earnest and The Picture of Dorian Gray, as well as James Joyce, the writer of the controversial novel Ulysses, alongside Samuel Beckett, the surreal genius of such theatrical pieces as Waiting for Godot and Endgame, right up to the present day with the brilliant Roddy Doyle, the celebrated writer of The Commitments. Bram Stoker wasn't the healthiest of infants, as he spent most of his early life in bed due to a mystery illness that robbed him of energy and offered up a huge range of confusing symptoms, stopping him from being able to stand or walk unaided, and also creating untold havoc with his sleep patterns. Yet, this bizarre sickness vanished without a trace when Bram Stoker was 7 years old, although the mental scars it left on the small boy took much longer to heal. The legacy of such a trauma for a young child remained with him for life, and undoubtedly resurfaced in Dracula, where the idea of everlasting sleep and resurrection from the dead certainly prevail. As a result of this early incapacitation, Bram Stoker was educated from his bedroom thanks to his love of reading. This was something he had in common with the celebrated novelist H.G. Wells, author of the seminal science fiction novel The War of the Worlds. He too was confined to bed as a child, and as a result read as many books as he could prevail upon his family to bring him. In a busy household that included 6 children, Bram Stoker was often ignored and overlooked because of his continual bed rest and illness, only venturing out for prescribed trips to the countryside to get fresh air and for services at nearby St. Michan's Church with the family. Bram Stoker's recovery was considered nothing short of a miracle by his doctors, confirmed in later years when he went on to become the most successful of all of his siblings, evidently making up for lost time. In fact, he excelled in the very thing he was robbed of when younger, namely physical exercise and sport. In 1864, he began attending Trinity College in Dublin, studying history, literature, mathematics, and physics, and he became a celebrated all-round athlete and star football player. Trinity College, founded in 1592, is part of the University of Dublin and has a rather old-fashioned but refreshingly accurate name, the College of the Holy and Undivided Trinity of Queen Elizabeth near Dublin. He kept up his association with the college via debating societies, and also completing further education courses, studying part-time for a higher degree in mathematics. It was through these debating societies that he became friendly with Oscar Wilde when Oscar took up his studies there in 1871. But their friendship was to falter when Bram Stoker stole the heart of Oscar Wilde's girlfriend, Florence Balcombe. It has even been suggested that the reason Oscar Wilde left Ireland was as a direct result of his heartache over Florence marrying Bram Stoker in 1878. Yet, with the benefit of hindsight and Oscar's predilection for his own sex, this does seem rather unlikely. Bram Stoker, continually dissatisfied with his job as a civil servant, began to write for the Dublin Evening Mail newspaper as an unpaid drama critic, reviewing as many shows as he could get to see, having already developed a great love of theater. There was one actor with whom Bram Stoker was fascinated, called Sir Henry Irving, a charismatic, larger-than-life man who exuded the same fascinating presence offstage as he did when playing a role on it. In 1871, Bram Stoker saw Irving play Hamlet and was surprised that no critic had reviewed the performance, so he took it upon himself to do so. In 1876, when visiting Dublin, Irving was shown the review that Bram Stoker had penned some years earlier, and was so impressed by it that he asked to meet the young critic. They became close friends and developed a real love-hate relationship, almost to the point where they couldn't stand to be in each other's company, but couldn't cope with being apart. One critic described it as a kind of incestuous, necrophiliac, oral sadistic all-in-all wrestling match. Sir Henry Irving came to stay in Dublin with Bram Stoker a number of times in the next few years. In 1878, Irving asked Bram Stoker to be his manager, which was an opportunity not to be missed, so the bored civil servant left bureaucracy and Ireland behind him for a new life in England with his wife Florence. The following year, Bram and Florence had their one and only child, a son, christened Noel. Florence often expressed concern over Sir Henry Irving's hold over her husband, commenting that it was as if Bram was hypnotized and under a cursed spell. She didn't disapprove of the friendship or dislike Irving, but she would later mention that she was troubled by the destructive nature of the love-hate relationship the two men shared. Fascinating as the world of Victorian theater might be, we do find ourselves asking a very important question. Where did Dracula come from? How on earth did Bram Stoker, this respectable, married, middle-class gentleman, who was occupied with managing the greatest actor of his generation, find the inspiration or the time to write one of the greatest horror novels of all time? Bram Stoker lived in an age where everything seemed to be happening all at once. Queen Victoria certainly dominated, but it was an amazing era of change, which affected everyone from the highest in the land to the lowliest. Charles Darwin wrote and published his thought-provoking The Origin of the Species in 1859, challenging religion by arguing that the human race evolved from the apes via a process of natural selection. In other words, creating the survival of the fittest theory. The Industrial Revolution brought about a wealthier economy, with Britain becoming dependent upon factories and mass production rather than agriculture for survival. It was also the age of the great engineers as typified by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who created the Great Western Railway, the transatlantic steamship the SS Great Britain, and the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol that hangs above the River Avon in the southwest of England, and at the time of conception in 1862, had the longest span of any bridge in the world. The Fabian Society was set up in London by a group of intellectuals to promote socialism, a concept whereby everyone is equal in terms of wealth and in society, with H.G. Wells, the author of The War of the Worlds, being a prominent and outspoken member for a time. The Great Exhibition of 1851, the first World Trade Fair, was held in the Crystal Palace, Hyde Park, London, with great success. showcasing as it did the modern industrial technology and design of the Victorian age. The Crystal Palace was built specifically to house the exhibition, with Isambard Kingdom Brunel drafted onto the committee to oversee design and production. But the construction was sadly destroyed by fire in 1936. In 1882, incandescent electric lights were introduced to London streets to replace the gas lamps that had to be manually lit every night and extinguished every morning. And it was against this progressive background that the Gothic novel really rose to prominence. And Bram Stoker evidently found this genre a source of inspiration. Looking back, it all began with the likes of Horace Walpole and his Castle of Otranto, and Mrs. Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho. Even the genteel Jane Austen tried her hand at all things Gothic in Northanger Abbey, and Emily Bronte, a quiet vicar's daughter, shocked the world with her terrifying anti-hero Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. These novels were the first of their kind to introduce a frightening effect on the reader, rather than making them feel comfortable and part of the story. The Gothic novel was the direct predecessor of modern horror fiction, which is thriving to this very day. The first vampire story that really caught the imagination was written at exactly the same time as Mary Shelley was creating Frankenstein, and Bram Stoker elaborated upon this tale to create his own vampire legend. It was simply called The Vampire, but spelt with a Y rather than an I, and it was written by John William Polidori, a personal physician to the eminent poet and writer Lord Byron, and was published in 1819. In fact, The Vampire and Frankenstein came out of a mutual experience. When Mary Shelley was staying with her poet husband Percy Bysshe Shelley at Lord Byron's villa by Lake Geneva in Switzerland, the weather was so appalling that they all stayed indoors. They read ghost stories to each other, and then Byron challenged Percy and Mary, as well as his doctor, to write their own ghost story. Mary Shelley won hands down with Frankenstein, but The Vampire by John Polidori certainly had its merits. In the same way that Bram Stoker would base his vampire, Count Dracula, on the man he was most in awe of, the famous actor Sir Henry Irving, the same could be said of John Polidori, who used the mad, bad, and dangerous to know Lord Byron as the basis for his vampire. In fact, John Polidori was the man who transformed the gritty folklore tales of vampires into something universally recognizable today, namely that of an aristocratic fiend who preys upon women in high society. Bram Stoker elaborated on that theme with his Count Dracula, a very aristocratic gentleman living in his own castle who preys on the innocent women of Victorian society when he is let loose in England. Of course, there was an even bigger influence on Bram Stoker when he began writing Dracula, and that was the mysterious case of Jack the Ripper. The British press dubbed this unknown murderer Jack the Ripper after a letter from Jack claimed responsibility for the gruesome killings. In the late summer and into the autumn of 1888, Jack the Ripper preyed on prostitutes and destitute women in the poverty-stricken Whitechapel area of London. This was a national and international sensation at the time, with the police unable to catch the killer, sometimes missing him by a matter of minutes. He is thought to have murdered 5 women, but there may well have been more. Each of the victims had their throat cut, and their bodies were horrifically mutilated with surgical precision. Theorists believe that the killer may have been a skilled medical surgeon, and even Queen Victoria's own physician, Sir William Gull, was counted as a suspect. The fact that the true identity of Jack the Ripper was never discovered gave him an air of mystery, danger, and intrigue. The public, although frightened, genuinely seemed to thirst for more news of him. When he vanished completely some months later, the public demanded to know more, their desire for a good horror story coming to the fore. Bram Stoker used elements of Jack the Ripper in his depiction of Count Dracula, creating a mythical, dangerous but alluring individual who nobody can actually identify. However, without a doubt, the main point of research for Bram Stoker's Dracula is generally accepted to be from Eastern European history, where the folklore tales of vampires originated. Vlad the Impaler, a 15th century nobleman, seems to fit the description of the Count perfectly. He was a prince, he was legendary for his cruelty, became famous for impaling his victims during execution, and was a demon in battles against his enemies. Even after his death, stories circulated that he was alive and was impossible to kill.